Christopher's size is unrealistic, apparently, because nothing says sophisticated television analysis like measuring a mobster's credibility in inches. Here is the problem with that logic. The scene is not asking whether Christopher could win a fair fight. The scene is asking whether a room full of comfortable, status-fed professionals can recognize real danger fast enough to survive it. And they can, instantly. Watch what happens in that club. These people are loud, entitled, and socially armored. They belong to a world where confidence is currency and consequences are mostly emails. Then Christopher leans in, says something that the camera refuses to translate, and suddenly the whole group discovers an urgent interest in leaving. No argument, no negotiation, no heroic posturing. So what changed? Not Christopher's height, not his tough guy look. The only thing that matters is leverage, the kind that does not require a speech. A whisper works when the person whispering is believable, close enough to act, and connected enough that refusing feels expensive. This is the part everyone keeps missing. Intimidation is not bodybuilding. It is infrastructure. It is proximity. It is certainty. And once that clicks, the whisper stops being a mystery line. It becomes a warning. The safest people in the corporate jungle panic the moment they realize they are not in it anymore. The obsession with what Christopher Moltisanti whispered in the D-Girl Club scene has become a small, relentless referendum on how intimidation is supposed to work, as though a 3-second, inaudible aside should satisfy the same standards as a sworn deposition. A group of polished New York careerists keeps bumping into Amy, postures for dominance, and then, after Christopher leans in and murmurs something unseen and unheard, collectively decides that another venue is suddenly calling their names. In other words, the scene invites speculation by design, a neat little vacuum where viewers can pour in whatever they want, from melodramatic threats to philosophical nonsense, and still feel clever for having an answer. The most credible answer, inconveniently, is also the least theatrical: a gun. Not a big speech, not a celebrity name drop, not an eloquent threat, but a concealed firearm pressed into the man's chest under the cover of a suit jacket, paired with a short prompt that does not require subtitles. Feel this is not poetry, it is mechanics. It explains the speed, the silence, and the immediate compliance. It also aligns with how Christopher is consistently portrayed, frequently armed, impulsive, and fully comfortable turning an annoyance into a physical crisis. But that tidy explanation also exposes why the scene is argued over so obsessively. Without the gun, the moment starts to look like a narrative cheat. A stranger's whisper does not reliably compel a group exit in real life, especially in a crowded club where ego and alcohol are doing their usual work. The yuppie does not have to be brilliant to question a random threat. He only has to be comfortably arrogant, and the scene has already established that comfort. It is therefore reasonable to point out that even a direct whisper, leave or get hurt, would not necessarily produce the precise reaction portrayed: wide eyes, immediate retreat, and a smooth group migration as though a fire drill had been announced. Yet the counter-argument is equally blunt, and it ruins the fantasy that money and confidence are universal armor. There are two jungles. In the corporate jungle, the most successful wallet is the loudest primate, and dominance is performed through status signals: the right suit, the right tone, the right entitlement. In the real jungle, the one built on bruises, weapons, and consequences, those signals evaporate. A person who is used to being feared because of professional stature can become acutely obedient when confronted with someone who seems genuinely ready to inflict violence. The most successful people in a sanitized world are not always the bravest when the world becomes unsanitized. That shift, from untouchable to vulnerable, is often instantaneous, and it is exactly the kind of shift the scene trades on. This is also why the argument about Christopher's size, how can someone of modest height plausibly grab collarbones, strike people, or terrify rooms, misunderstands how intimidation operates in organized crime. The series is explicit that the real threat is not muscle mass, it is infrastructure. The man in front of a civilian does not have to be a heavyweight champion if the civilian believes that refusing him invites follow-up visits, additional men, and escalating consequences. That is the entire logic of the enterprise. Violence as a service backed by a network. A compact man with a weapon and a connected reputation can be more frightening than a large man with nothing but attitude. The civilian does not have to fear Christopher's biceps. He has to fear what Christopher represents and what Christopher can outsource. Still, the guessing game persists because the whisper is treated as a prompt for catchphrase worship rather than a question about storytelling. It becomes an excuse to parade familiar lines, the fake biker gang identity, the exaggerated claims of moxie, the complaint that certain conversations cannot be had again, the self-pitying funeral monologue that drifts into metaphysics and then blames computers for the inability to prove uniqueness. These lines are repeated not because they answer anything, but because repetition functions as a social handshake. When the content is unknowable, the reflex is to perform membership by quoting anything that sounds adjacent to intimidation, masculinity, or existential confusion. The result is less analysis than ritual, a chorus of recycled soundbites orbiting a simple question that the show deliberately refuses to answer on screen. If the scene were only a trivia puzzle, it would not sustain this level of attention. It matters because D-Girl is not only about a club scuffle. It is about Christopher's identity crisis with a side of aspiration. He wants to be more than a soldier in Tony's orbit. He wants the sheen of Hollywood credibility, the respect of writers, the illusion that he can switch arenas and still command attention. The episode repeatedly shows him reaching for cultural capital he does not understand and cannot quite earn, then reacting with the same petulant rage that defines his life in organized crime. The club moment is therefore not a random flex. It is a reminder that whatever he is pretending to be in New York, artist, insider, tastemaker, his most authentic role remains what he has always been, a violent man with access to violence. When he whispers, the room listens, not because he is eloquent, but because he is believable. There is a further irony here that the episode does not bother to hide. Christopher achieves the gangster confidence he once fantasized about, and it does not satisfy him. The series consistently portrays him as someone who confuses achievement with identity. If he becomes a feared enforcer, he will want to be an artist. If he becomes an artist, he will want to be respected by people who despise him. If he earns respect, he will want adoration. His ambition is not a ladder, it is a treadmill. Even his victories are temporary because the goal is never the result. The goal is the fantasy of being someone else. That treadmill is one reason his intimidation reads as both effective and unstable. He can be frighteningly competent in one moment and humiliatingly insecure in the next, which keeps him in a constant state of simmering grievance. That neediness does not make him safe. It makes him volatile. When attention shifts from the club whisper to the broader question of whether Christopher is among the most frightening characters in the series, the argument quickly becomes less comedic. Beneath his comedic incompetence, beneath the whining, the entitlement, the habit of treating every slight as a trauma, there is an instability that can turn private anger into public harm. He can move from charm to threat with no visible change in expression. He can carry out murder with a flat affect that reads as emptiness rather than passion. He can threaten someone's body as casually as someone else threatens a reputation. And the lack of visible emotion is often more alarming than a tantrum because it suggests the violence is not reactive, it is available. That availability is also evident in how he treats people close to him. The show does not ask anyone to pretend that his domestic cruelty is a footnote. It is part of the portrait. A man who demands loyalty and affection while reserving the right to punish. A man whose instability makes intimacy a hazard. Of course, the hierarchy of fear is not settled by one character study. There are other men in the story whose menace is more stable, more seasoned, more calmly sadistic. There is the old-school predator whose reputation is built on sustained cruelty rather than tantrums. There is the boss whose authority turns violence into policy, making harm less impulsive but more consequential. There is also the uncomfortable truth that the most frightening figure is not always the loudest. It is often the one capable of making terrible decisions without drama. In that comparison, Christopher can look like a chaotic subordinate, a man whose incompetence occasionally blunts his threat, because he is as likely to self-destruct as he is to win. Yet, that is exactly why he remains frightening. Unpredictability is not a weakness to the person on the receiving end. It is a risk multiplier. A volatile man with a gun and an ego is not comforting simply because his plans are sloppy. The size debate returns here because it is a comforting distraction. It is easier to argue about inches and pounds than to acknowledge what the show actually depicts. That danger is social, not purely physical. Christopher's intimidation does not come from looking like an action hero. It comes from being the kind of person who digs into violence as casually as others dig into small talk. It comes from being connected to a network that normal people do not want to test. It comes from the fact that he routinely carries a weapon and can use it. The show even plays with the idea of where that weapon might be concealed, because concealment itself is part of the threat. The gun is not a billboard, it is an option. Whether it is tucked in a holster at the ankle or hidden under a jacket, the point is the same. He does not need to advertise. The civilian only needs to suspect, and suspicion is often enough. The club whisper, then, is less a riddle than an illustration of how credibility is built. Christopher's earlier failures, moments where he is ignored, dismissed, or treated as a nuisance, make the D-girl moment sharper. The scene is often described as the opposite of his humiliating bakery encounter, where once he begged for respect and did not get it, now he speaks quietly and gets immediate compliance. That reversal signals growth in one narrow sense. He has learned how to project menace efficiently. Yet the show refuses to let this growth become a triumph. It is simply another example of his talent being best expressed in the ugliest skill set available to him. Even when he wins the power exchange, he remains trapped in the life that makes those exchanges meaningful. If whispers were confined to scripted drama, the fixation might be dismissed as harmless fandom. But whispering has become a broader social obsession, and reality television has weaponized it with particular enthusiasm. On a reunion stage, a whisper is not a threat of physical violence. It is a threat of narrative theft. Two cast members conduct a side conversation while another person speaks, and the room shifts. Some observers interpret the whisper as an intentional signal, a way of telling the speaker that her monologue is not worth attention, a tiny rebellion against someone perceived as condescending. Others read it as baseline rudeness, a public display of low manners dressed up as confidence. Both reactions are understandable because the gesture is inherently loaded. A whisper performed in public is never neutral. It is a private act staged for an audience. The content of the reunion whisper leaks out in fragments, and what emerges is not flattering. There is an apology offered to a man accused of cheating, framed as regret for speaking truth publicly. There is a soothing response that converts wrongdoing into a story about personal sensitivity, assurances that honesty is fine, that no harm was intended, that the moment will pass. On the surface, this reads as maturity. A year later, two people finding a workable peace. Underneath, it reads as conditioning. An apology to the wrongdoer is not grace. It is a pattern of managing the wrongdoer's reputation and emotional comfort. It is the kind of interpersonal reflex that keeps harmful behavior cheap. The cost is paid by the person harmed, who absorbs guilt for speaking plainly, while the person who caused the harm receives reassurance for having done it. The frustration intensifies when the man's romantic timeline suggests not simply a new relationship, but a return to a previous partner from before the show. That detail matters because it speaks to motive. Returning to an old relationship can imply that the televised one was always disposable, that the show functioned less as a sincere search for partnership and more as a strategic audition for screen time. A reunion that wants credibility would interrogate that, because it is the difference between messy human behavior and calculated participation. Instead, the questioning appears to drift, leaving the more structural suspicion unaddressed. Not merely that he cheated, but that he may have treated the entire televised relationship as a temporary accessory. Meanwhile, the reunion's other gravitational force is a participant whose tone reliably slides into condescension, as though contempt were a personality trait to be celebrated. The rhetorical move is always the same. Take a conflict, inflate it into a moral verdict, then justify disproportionate retaliation by claiming provocation. It is the mess with the bull philosophy dressed up as empowerment, a posture that confuses adulthood with theatrical aggression. Watching someone defend earlier cruelty by insisting the other person started it is like watching a grown adult negotiate emotional responsibility the way a teenager negotiates curfew. The show's footage does not support the scale of the retaliation, but the persona requires retaliation to feel inevitable, and inevitability is a convenient substitute for accountability. In that environment, the whisperer's indifference becomes a tempting form of poetic justice. Ignoring the condescending speaker visibly irritates her, which can feel satisfying because attention is the currency of that stage, and nothing hurts a self-appointed judge like being treated as background noise. Silence becomes an insult sharper than rebuttal because it denies the performance what it demands. Yet satisfaction is not the same as virtue. Whispering through someone else's speaking time is still discourteous, and the fact that the target is unpleasant does not elevate the behavior into heroism. Reality television specializes in selling poor manners as empowerment, and the audience is trained to applaud whatever feels like a moment, regardless of whether it would be tolerable in any real conversation. The host's attempt to call out the whispering makes the production incentives obvious. The show wants conflict to be audible, legible, and easily packaged. Side whispers are frustrating because they suggest drama while denying the microphone's content. The host redirects, hoping for a public exchange, hoping for a sharp comeback, hoping for a clip that can be replayed. Instead, the whisperers refuse to provide the expected confrontation. One remains calm, the other remains unbothered, and the moment passes with the unsettling implication that the whisper mattered more than the public conversation. That refusal to perform can be read as composure or avoidance, chemistry or calculation, depending on how much benefit of the doubt the audience is willing to grant. Taken together, the reunion material produces blunt character diagnoses. The cheater is criticized not only for infidelity, but for cowardice, a preference for deception over an honest ending, a tendency to keep options open, an ability to receive forgiveness without earning accountability, a comfort with being treated as a fragile, nice person, rather than as a responsible adult. The wronged party is viewed with a mix of admiration and concern. Impressive composure, yes, but also a tolerance for poor treatment that borders on self-erasure, a readiness to be understanding, even when understanding functions as self-betrayal. The condescending antagonist is criticized for emotional immaturity disguised as strength, a habit of making everything personal, escalatory, and punitive, then acting surprised when others stop taking her seriously. And that brings the analysis back to whispering as a device. In The Sopranos, the whisper works because the context supplies force, the plausibility of immediate violence, the established credibility of a man who carries weapons and has committed murder, the infrastructure of a crew that makes refusal feel risky. The content of the whisper is almost irrelevant because the audience understands the world. In reality television, the whisper works because context supplies a different force, attention, humiliation, editing, reputation. The content is again almost irrelevant because the audience understands the genre. In both cases, whispering creates a social imbalance by turning the public into spectators of a private exchange. It manufactures intimacy through exclusion and authority through secrecy. This is why audiences cannot let whispers go. A whisper is an invitation and an insult at once. The public is forced to watch the gesture while being denied the words, which produces the perfect blend of involvement and exclusion. Scripted drama uses that blend to compress threat into a moment. Reality television uses it to hint at alliances, secrets, and behind-the-scenes truth. In both cases, the audience responds by supplying what it cannot hear. In scripted drama, the supply takes the form of jokes and invented threats. In reality television, the supply takes the form of moral judgment and motive hunting. The whisper becomes a vacuum, and the vacuum gets filled, because silence is intolerable, and speculation is entertainment. The alternative theories, offering a bicycle as a peace offering, invoking a mock motorcycle gang identity, or claiming the real danger was being forced to endure another set by a dreadful band, are instructive precisely because they are evasions. They treat intimidation as a comedy sketch, because admitting the simple mechanism feels too plain for a show with such rich texture. Even the digressions about where a fictional singer recorded, or the abrupt detours into domestic scolding and medical one-liners, function as noise that keeps the mystery alive. The humor is less an answer than a ritual of belonging, performed to avoid uncertainty in public. So what did Christopher whisper? The most responsible answer is not something clever, and it is certainly not a recycled monologue about fingerprints, proof, and the limits of computers, no matter how comforting it is to pretend that epistemology can solve nightclub behavior. The responsible answer is that he likely delivered a simple directive: leave, now, backed by either the unmistakable press of a weapon or the unmistakable certainty that refusing would end badly. No grand speech, no elaborate humiliation, just a reminder that this is not the corporate jungle and the rules are not negotiable. Whispers aren't harmless. Subscribe.